we're going to transition into our return to in-person learning with rebuilding belonging and emotional safety presentation by Ms. Josie Uribe. Go ahead and take us away, Ms. Josie.
Thank you. I'm pretty excited. A lot of this, I think, goes in line with what Jillian was saying, so I hope that it's helpful. So yes, I'm going to be talking about our return to in-person learning, specifically looking at rebuilding belonging and emotional safety. So starting out, I wanted to take a look at some of the barriers for our students. So the risks that they may be exposed to that's influencing their overall functioning. So chronic loneliness, we talked about that before, that puts our brains in a highly stressed state and it impacts our overall wellness, both physically and emotionally. Looking at mass trauma, I include not only our students in this, but of course our staff. Each of us have been exposed to some disruption, some loss or change, and not really having much predictability and control. And that leads to an increase in feelings of anxiety, right? And then what's going on for us, so what's happening in our brains is really the need to search for safety. So how to stay safe, reading and analyzing everything around us. Can we go back, Josh? And categorizing what is safe or what's not. And that's an exhausting state to be in, right? That's a distracting state to be in. So with all of that, how do we as staff demonstrate safety? We do this by building safety through community, through belonging, and through awareness and understanding. Thanks, Josh. So community, right? So belonging is essentially community. It's identifying with the community. So what are the benefits of belonging? And so there's a lot of research that notes that for students, we can see an increase. When there is an increase in feelings of belonging, we see an increase in motivation, academic performance, emotional awareness, emotional wellness, optimism, self-esteem, self-efficacy, self-concept, sociability, and a decrease in dropout rates. This is the buy-in, right? This is what we want to see with our students. These are our students that are college, career, community ready. That's a huge payoff. And so two of the big considerations as we move forward in developing plans in welcoming our students back and building community are going to be looking at equity and trauma-informed care. So the classroom has this unique opportunity to provide equal supports and equitable opportunity for all of our students. It's not about fitting into a mold, but breaking that mold altogether, right? And recognizing that our students are unique individuals with unique learning styles and skills and histories, and that they are the experts in their lives. Moving forward, let's honor each student's uniqueness as valuable rather than as a deficit. Looking at discussing equity and cultural competency routinely, challenging our own biases and having open conversations that challenge beliefs and perceptions and that are informative and grounded in representation. I want to speak not only as a staff member in a school district, but I want to speak as a parent. And so I have a biracial child, and one of the things that I appreciate from the school that he's in, and he's a little guy, is that they incorporate cultural competency constantly, whether it is through books or through activities or through celebrations. They constantly introduce new concepts, or they constantly introduce or connect with family members about what is it that those families celebrate and what do they represent and what are the things that they bring into their households, and they bring it into the schools. And the reason that this is so important to me is that, a few months ago, Diwali was celebrated, which is an Indian holiday. And for my kid, they went over several books in his class that represented Diwali, and he was able to identify characters and traditions that were represented in that book that were similar to what he practices and what he looks like. So that was huge, right? That's a moving piece for, I think, any parent and for students. That's not something that was typical for me growing up. And so I am thankful that that's an opportunity that my child has. And then looking further into conversations about culturally responsive teaching. So looking at education and teaching grounded in staff displaying cultural competence, creating learning environments that are culturally representing all students, and also accommodating our instruction to the culture and the learning styles and differences of all of our students. And now taking a look at trauma-informed care, we can expect that this might be a difficult adjustment for our students and for our staff. We might experience increases in trauma responses, and it's going to be important for sites to discuss response plans when responding to these highly challenging situations. And that includes or can be addressed through teaching self-regulation skills, incorporating mindfulness techniques into the classroom, de-escalation techniques, and trauma-informed practices. So moving away from solely punitive reactions to skills that support trauma-impacted people. And that this can look really as simple as normalizing reactions and validating statements. So as simple as, yes, this is a difficult time, or yes, this can be very scary. Here's what we're going to do today. Yes, I was also kind of nervous to come back. This is what I did to take care of that. Any of those things, right? Normalizing and again, validating. So let's take a look at some approaches for and some developmental considerations. The first thing that I want to say is that, recognize that belonging is a fundamental human need, and it doesn't go away, right? We can see this from early attachment with infants to really adulthood. We are always monitoring how we feel and how we feel we fit into all social interactions. When we feel like we don't belong, when we feel like we are excluded, rejected, or like an outsider, it really saps our resources and our energy. It distracts us. It keeps us from being fully present in the moment. And I think that a really relatable thing to think about is like, think about a time when you were invited somewhere where you weren't going to know anyone. And that's a really uncomfortable thing, right? Do I go? Do I not go? How do I spend my hours? Oh my gosh, is anyone going to talk to me? What's that going to look like? What do I da-da-da? Right? That's an uncomfortable place to be. So that feeling doesn't go away. And I think that it's really important to consider that is a normal worry, and to normalize that with our students, that yes, it could be that you were top dog in your class or whatever it was, and then the second you go into your next class, maybe that feeling isn't going to be there anymore. Maybe it's a matter of, I connected really well with this teacher, I connected really well with these students, and as I go to a different grade, those feelings might not be there, and that's jarring for a lot of our students. And what that can do is students might spiral when they feel like they don't belong. If you think back to, or if you were present when I talked about loneliness, right, those feelings of exclusion, those register in the same areas of our brain as feeling physical pain. So this is a huge piece, right, is that when we don't feel like we belong, it makes it very much so that it's difficult to attend, it's difficult to focus, it's difficult to be present. That's why this matters, right, is to build up these skills. So how do we do that? So how do we practice that inclusivity? How do we practice building up community? I think an important piece to start with is really prioritizing uplifting staff and student interactions or actions. I think a lot of us already do that. A lot of sites already do that. But sharing those behaviors, sharing those actions through announcements, through social media. I know we've done that. Posts, newsletters, or bulletin boards, or whatever your school has available in the classroom. If there's like a bulletin board or whatever it is, just highlighting some of the positive things that our students are doing or that our staff are doing. Looking at finding similarities. What are some of the things, what are shared hobbies, interests, or even doing like shared projects where, multiple students can work together to, achieve a single goal. Looking at intentional conversations about classroom culture, and also collaborating on classroom norms. I ran a lot of groups, for many years. And that was something that we did at the very beginning, or when a student was introduced, or if we were closing a group. This is what we constantly talked about. How do we think the group is going right now? We've been in it for half a year. Did we reach our goals that we all talked and agreed upon? setting up goals, that was all student driven. Was, what do you think our group should look like? How do you think our group should function? What should be the rules of our group? What happens when someone violates that rule? All of those things were so important. And what it did was it had students buy into the process. And there was also the piece that it empowered them. Those were their rules and we displayed it for them, right? It gave them a voice. It gave them community. And that was such a huge piece. Belonging routines. I love belonging routines. They are so much fun. I love seeing them. They're awesome. And that is that creating that classroom motto. I know some people may have seen videos of like special handshakes. Obviously with COVID, we're probably not going to go that direction, but like classroom mottos or songs or chants. Recently, I was able to do a training for another colleague. And when she starts up her groups and her team meetings, she gives a shout out to each individual team. And it's so empowering and it's so awesome because you can feel the shift, and it's virtual, but you can feel the shift of how everyone just gets super into it. And she says, like, you matter, you matter, you matter. And I think that's so deeply important for people to hear. And it really just sets up the tone, right? So those belonging rituals and routines. And then, oh, sorry, Josh. And then of course, like modeling, understanding, and acceptance. You know, kids are going to be looking at us to see how we're handling our emotions and our relationships. And they're going to form ideas based off of how we do those things. So being aware of how do we model inclusion and acceptance and curiosity, any of those things, how do we include those things in those discussions? Do we appear uncomfortable? Are we appearing as if, you know, we're not interested, or is it something that we can approach these things in a very open way that models to our kids that we're interested and we want to hear from them? What I have here is looking at emotional safety. So what are some ways that we can build up that emotional safety? Again, I go back to validating and normalizing, which is such an important skill. You know, normalizing that, having feelings of anxiety when coming back, having feelings of vulnerability, all of those things, that is a normal feeling to have, right? Because right now there's so much uncertainty and change. And so that is a normal way to feel. Predictability and building familiarity. The important piece there is that those two things, what they do is they set up an air of safety. So having those displayed like class schedules of this is what we're doing today, and even talking about deviations, you know, typically we have math at this time, but we have a guest speaker, so I'm setting us up for that or whatever. You know, explaining those things, especially for our students who are a little higher on the anxiety spectrum, to be able to talk about deviations and what that looks like. That building that familiarity, so helping students and families be familiar with like any of the changes that are happening through like pictures or social stories, videos. That's something we're already pushing out, which is awesome, but really being able to push that information out early. Building resiliency. So, you know, having our students reflect on their past, that, you know, our students have had previous challenges and they've overcome that. I think it's so important to empower a student by reminding them that they've done hard things before, and they have skills and tools to make it through hard times. And then practicing SEL, this is something that our counselors are pushing out that is just so awesome, and I'm so excited for. Collaborating on expectations, again, going back to having those open discussions with our students and having them be a part of that process. Any examples of, you know, if we're feeling this way, we can do this, having those discussions. And again, I spoke to deviations. I think that the home to school collaboration is so important. I think that right now there's so many times where I feel like something has happened in a kid's life and we don't find out until we're able to reach that parent finally. And it's like, oh yeah, so-and-so passed away or something. And it's like, wait, what? Like, how long has this kid been in class and I didn't know about that? Or how long has this been going on? I didn't know about that. So having that open conversation and collaboration with our families as well. Finally, I want to talk about challenging our expectations. I think this is going to be, I think this is hard for a lot of people. I think that even in my own mindset, I'm thinking when I go back, it's going to be, you know, business as usual, and really having to challenge that norm. and have a, and understand that may not be what that's going to look like, right? And I think for those of you that are in leadership, it's not just going to be limited to challenging expectations of your staff, but also of yourself, and also what everyone is really capable of, right? Because the experience of trauma is not just going to be unique to our students, it's impacting all of us. So, considering those things of how can I adjust to this? Can I give myself time to adjust to what it's going to look like coming back? What are the expectations that I can hold of myself? What are the expectations I can hold realistically of students who are impacted by trauma and isolation, which is very, very destabilizing? And setting realistic goals, keeping those things in mind, keeping in mind that our students have spent an entire year out of school, right? Out of face-to-face interaction, physically being together, and how much that impacts their social development. We have students that have gone from one grade, jumping into another, jumping into a new school, jumping into different classrooms, and spending an entire year in those places without physically being there. And that's a really jarring thing. That's a really strange experience. For some of our kids, this is their only experience that they've had in school, and it's been virtual. And how that impacts their ability to function socially, right? There's so many nuances to being in person. There's so many moments that are spontaneous that come from being in person, and how to respond to those things. So it is a huge loss for our kids when they're not able to practice those skills in person. I think adjusting that expectation that the ninth grader coming in is going to have that maturity level or that skill level of the typical ninth grader a few years back, right? Being able to understand and kind of have that trauma-informed mindset of there might be other things that are impacting our students. So again, setting realistic goals, and then of course, always remembering what we do and don't have control over is really going to help us feel like we have more control of like those anxious thoughts, and really set up plans for ourselves of what I actually can do, rather than spiraling in things that we don't have control over. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ms. Josie. That's great stuff that I think is going to be very important to be able to tie that in with our data, and preparation for a return to our kids to campus, right? And just looking at what those expectations are, and really setting realistic goals that we can have. So we appreciate that. Thank you for that. And what we